In the midst of a raging storm, the mother wolf is trying her best to bring her fourth child into this world. Trembling with exhaustion, her eyes shine with silent joy as her cubs huddle together. Carlos, a skilled hunter of the region, watched silently, amazed by the fierce vitality in the face of the raging storm. The first time Carlos met the mother wolf, she was struggling with the hardships of pregnancy and the cold of the snow. The forest was strangely quiet that day, broken only by the occasional creak of ice and the crunch of his boots. With his rifle slung over his shoulder, Carlos scanned the landscape for any sign of game. Surviving in these places was not easy, especially for a man living alone. As he advanced through the wind-blown snow, something caught his eye, a shape lying motionless against the white background. He stopped abruptly, his heart pounding. Instinctively, his hand went to his rifle, though he did not draw it. Slowly, cautiously, he approached. It was a wolf, a female wolf, looking at her swollen belly. She lay curled up on the snow, her grey fur matted and streaked with dirt. Her chest rose and fell faintly, a weak rhythm that suggested she hadn't much strength left. Her golden eyes flicked up to meet his as he approached, burning with equal parts fear and defiance. Carlos froze a few feet away, studying the animal. He noticed faint paw prints scattered nearby, but they were old, partially covered by fresh snow. There were no signs of other wolves. She was alone, and given her state, she'd likely been that way for a while. Her ribs pressed against her skin, sharp and prominent, telling a story of days without food. She shifted slightly, baring her teeth in a weak snarl as he stepped closer. It wasn't much of a threat, more an act of instinct than true aggression. Her body trembled with the effort of the movement, and Carlos stopped where he was, lowering himself to her level. His gaze softened as he took in the scene. From his pack, he pulled a piece of dried meat. It wasn't much, just a scrap from the lunch he'd planned to eat himself. He laid it gently on the snow, a few feet away from her, and backed up slowly, giving her space. The wolf watched him intently, her ears flicking forward, her nose twitching as the scent of the meat reached her. After a long, tense moment, she inched forward, her movement slow and cautious. Her eyes never left him as she stretched her neck toward the food. She sniffed it thoroughly before taking a tentative bite. When no threat came, she devoured it in quick, desperate gulps, the gnawing hunger overriding her caution. Carlos watched silently, his breath fogging the air in front of him. There was something deeply unsettling, yet profoundly moving about the sight. He didn't know what had led this creature to be stranded here, alone and vulnerable. Maybe she'd been abandoned by her pack. Maybe they'd been killed. Whatever the reason, he felt an ache in his chest as he realized the parallels between them. Like the wolf, Carlos was no stranger to solitude. For years, he had chosen to live out here, far from the noise and chaos of people. But in this moment, the wilderness didn't feel vast and freeing. It felt cold and uncaring. He saw the wolf as more than just an animal. She was another soul, trying to survive in a world that didn't make it easy. "You're not much different from me, are you?" Carlos muttered, almost to himself. His voice was low, barely audible over the gentle whisper of the wind. The wolf didn't respond, of course. She finished the last of the meat and licked the snow where it had lain, trying to find any lingering crumbs. She sat back on her haunches, still watching him, her expression wary, but less hostile now. Carlos knew he couldn't do much for her right now. He had no shelter to offer, no means to move her if she refused, but he couldn't just walk away either. He rose to his feet, brushing the snow off his knees, and adjusted the pack on his shoulders. "I'll come back," he said softly, almost as if he were making a promise. With one last look at the wolf, Carlos turned and began his trek back toward his cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He didn't know what he'd do tomorrow or how he'd make it work, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let the wolf face the winter alone. Carlos stepped out of his cabin as the first rays of sunlight broke through the dense forest. The frost crunched beneath his boots, and his breath hung in the air as he carried a bag of food and water. His small wooden cabin stood on the edge of a vast wilderness, and though the isolation was his refuge, it had rarely felt this significant. He followed the narrow, familiar path toward the spot where he had found the lone wolf the previous day. When he arrived, the wolf was still there. It lay curled on the frozen ground, motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Its silvery fur glimmered faintly under the morning light, catching his eye in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. Carlos crouched a safe distance away and set the food down on the snow. "Kira," he whispered, the name slipping from his lips as naturally as the morning air. He didn't know why it felt right, but it did. The shimmer of her coat reminded him of moonlight, something rare and untouchable. Yet here she was. Kira lifted her head slightly, her golden eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. There was exhaustion in that gaze, mingled with suspicion, but she did not flee. Instead, she watched him silently, her body tense, but still. Carlos took a step back, then another, until he was far enough for her to feel safe. Only then did she inch forward, sniffing the food cautiously before devouring it with the hunger of a creature that had gone too long without a proper meal. This routine became their silent agreement. Each morning, Carlos brought food and water, leaving them at the same spot. At first, Kira only approached when he was out of sight, her footprints in the snow the only evidence she had eaten. But over time, her wariness began to wane. She started inching closer while he was still present, though she always kept a careful distance. Carlos moved slowly, speaking softly to her as he sat a few yards away. "Don't worry, girl," he murmured one morning. "I'm not here to hurt you." His voice was steady, almost conversational, as if he were talking to an old friend. He told her about his life in the woods, how he had chosen solitude over the chaos of the world beyond the trees. He told her about the long winters and the quiet nights by the fire, about the things he missed and the things he didn't. Kira listened, not with understanding, of course, but with a stillness that made him feel she heard him all the same. One day, as Carlos placed the food on the ground, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Kira's belly was swollen, her movements slower, more labored. She was pregnant, and from the way her ribs still showed beneath her fur, it was clear she was struggling. Carlos frowned, a pang of concern settling deep in his chest. She didn't just need food, she needed a place, a shelter where she could safely bring her pups into the world. The forest was no friend to the weak. Carlos had lived there long enough to know that predators and cold could make short work of those unable to protect themselves. The thought of Kira giving birth in these harsh conditions made his mind race. She wouldn't survive without help, and neither would her pups. Without hesitation, Carlos made a plan. The next day he returned not only with food, but with tools. Carrying an axe and a coil of rope, he scouted the area for sturdy branches and began working on a small shelter near the spot Kira had claimed as her own. His hands, calloused from years of labor, worked swiftly and efficiently. He cut and stacked the wood, lashing the pieces together to form a simple structure. Inside, he spread thick layers of moss and dried leaves, covering them with the warm blankets he had brought from his cabin. The makeshift shelter was small but sturdy, designed to block the biting wind and trap warmth. It wasn't much, but it was all he could do. As he worked, he spoke to Kira in the same calm tone, explaining his actions as if she could understand. "You'll need this, girl. Winter's not going to get any kinder." Kira stayed a short distance away, watching him with an intensity that never wavered. When the shelter was finally complete, Carlos stepped back, his body aching but his heart lighter. Kira approached cautiously, her steps deliberate. She sniffed at the entrance, her ears twitching as if assessing the safety of this new addition to her world. Slowly, she stepped inside, curling up on the soft bedding with a sigh that Carlos could almost interpret as relief. He stood there for a moment, watching her settle in. This was the first real sign of trust she had shown him, and it filled him with a quiet sense of accomplishment. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Carlos gathered his tools and turned to leave. He glanced back once, seeing her eyes peeking out from the shadows of the shelter. "You'll be safe here," he said softly, before heading back toward his cabin. That night, as the wind howled through the forest, Carlos sat by his fire and thought of Kira. For the first time in years, the solitude of the woods didn't feel so lonely. Carlos sat by the fireplace in his small cabin, listening to the crackling wood as it struggled against the rising howl of the wind outside. The storm had been brewing for hours, but now the sharp whistle of icy gusts slipping through the cracks in the cabin made him uneasy. He glanced at the window, where frost had begun to creep up the corners. Snowflakes, dense and relentless, hurled themselves against the glass, blotting out the view of the forest. Something gnawed at the back of his mind. Kira. That lone, pregnant wolf he'd been looking after for weeks. The thought of her, weak and alone out there in the unforgiving cold, made his chest tighten. He stood abruptly, grabbing his thickest coat and scarf, his flashlight, and a small bag of dried meat. Without hesitation, he pulled on his boots and braced himself as he opened the door. The cold hit him like a wall. Wind whipped snow into his face, and the biting chill seeped into his skin almost instantly. He pulled his scarf tighter and started down the familiar path into the woods. Each step was slow and deliberate as he pushed against the storm, his flashlight beam barely cutting through the swirling chaos of white. Hours passed. His legs burned with effort, and the cold gnawed at his fingers despite the gloves. He kept calling out softly, "Kira, Kira!" The wind swallowed his voice, but he didn't stop. He scanned the ground for tracks, any sign of her. At last, under the faint glow of the flashlight, he noticed a set of paw prints partially buried by fresh snow. They led to a cluster of rocks, and behind them, a small, dark opening. A cave. Carlos climbed over the icy boulders, his breath visible in the frigid air, and crouched at the entrance. Inside, Kira lay curled up in a tight ball. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and her body shivered uncontrollably. Her golden eyes, dulled with exhaustion, flicked toward him as he entered. She didn't try to move. Then he saw it, the unmistakable signs of labor. Her sides quivered, and she let out soft, strained whimpers. "Kira," Carlos said gently, lowering himself to her level. "I'm here. I've got you." He carefully slipped off his coat and draped it over her trembling body. Her fur was damp with snow and sweat, and he could feel the heat radiating from her as he touched her side. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice calm but firm, as if he could will the fear from her eyes. Through the night, the storm raged on, but Carlos didn't waver. He sat by Kira's side, stroking her gently, whispering soothing words. He wasn't sure she understood. Her labor came in waves, each contraction racking her frail body. Carlos worked tirelessly to keep her warm, adjusting the coat, feeding her tiny bits of dried meat when she could manage it, and wiping away the snowflakes that drifted in from the cave's entrance. At some point, the hours began to blur. His legs were numb from sitting on the cold ground, and his back ached from leaning over Kira, but he couldn't bring himself to rest. Each moment felt critical, and his focus never strayed from her. When the first light of dawn began to creep into the cave, Carlos noticed the storm hadn't let up. The wind still howled, and snowflakes still tumbled furiously outside. But inside the cave, something extraordinary was unfolding. Kira gave one final push, and a tiny, wriggling pup emerged, its fur damp and glistening. Carlos froze, watching in awe as Kira instinctively turned to clean the newborn. Moments later, another pup followed, then another. By the time the fourth and final pup was born, Carlos found himself holding his breath. The tiny wolves huddled close to their mother, seeking warmth and comfort. Kira, though visibly exhausted, nuzzled each of them with a tenderness that made Carlos's heart ache. Her golden eyes, now brighter than they'd been all night, flicked up to meet his. For the first time, he saw something beyond pain and fear. He saw gratitude, trust, and perhaps even a glimmer of joy. He leaned back against the cave wall, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Despite the howling storm and the biting cold, the cave felt warm, almost sacred. Watching Kira with her newborns, Carlos couldn't help but marvel at the resilience of nature, the determination of life to thrive, even in the harshest conditions. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind losing its ferocity. But Carlos didn't notice. He was lost in the quiet miracle of that moment, surrounded by the soft sounds of new life. Carlos woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees, the air still crisp from the night before. His thoughts drifted immediately to Kira and her pups. The memory of their tiny bodies wriggling beside her in the warm, makeshift den brought a rare smile to his face. Today, like every other day since their arrival, he had a duty to fulfill. Slinging a small satchel over his shoulder, he packed dried meat and a few scraps from his meager pantry. This family of wolves depended on him now, and he wouldn't let them down. Reaching the den, Carlos moved with practiced care. He approached the entrance quietly, mindful not to disturb Kira or her pups. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and earth, mingled with the musky aroma of wolves. Gently, he set the food down on a flat rock near the entrance. Taking a few steps back, he crouched low, watching. Kira peeked out cautiously, her golden eyes scanning the clearing. Recognizing Carlos, she stepped forward, her movement still protective and deliberate. She sniffed the offering before nudging it toward the pups with her nose. Carlos noticed the den had started to look weathered from the recent winds. He moved to gather branches and tufts of moss nearby, carefully constructing an extra barrier to shield them from the elements. The wolves watched in silence, Kira's steady gaze following his every movement. Sitting back on his heels, Carlos caught sight of the black wolf lingering on the ridge. It had been watching from a distance for days, keeping an unspoken vigil over the family. Today, though, it crept closer. Slowly, the black wolf crossed into the clearing, head held low in submission as it neared the den. Carlos froze, unsure of what would happen next. To his surprise, Kira didn't growl or bristle. Instead, she allowed the black wolf to approach her pups. The pups, oblivious to the tension, yipped and tumbled toward the newcomer. Carlos watched as the black wolf sniffed them gently before lying down among them. It was clear now that this wolf was no stranger to Kira. Perhaps they had been part of the same pack once, before tragedy had splintered them apart. The way it played with the pups, nudging them softly and sharing warmth, painted a picture of a makeshift family finding their way back to one another. Carlos couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. The black wolf had taken on the role of a guardian, a father figure of sorts. It hunted, brought back small scraps for Kira, and even stood watch at night while she rested. Carlos leaned against a tree, arms crossed, and smiled faintly. There was something deeply moving about seeing this wild family knit themselves together, overcoming what had likely been a harrowing winter. As days turned into weeks, Carlos began to notice changes within himself too. The ache of loneliness that had haunted him for so long began to ease. Each day, he'd sit near the den, telling stories to the wolves, Not that they could understand his words, but it felt good to speak aloud again. He talked about his childhood in the mountains, his father teaching him to hunt, and how he ended up here, alone in the wilderness. Kira would watch him intently, her golden eyes steady and calm. Sometimes the pups would crawl over to him, their tiny noses sniffing at his boots, their playful curiosity breaking through his guarded heart. One pup in particular caught his attention. The smallest of the litter, Tiny, was slower than the others, often lagging behind during their clumsy attempts at play. But what Tiny lacked in speed, it made up for in bravery. It was always the first to explore new corners of the den or sniff at Carlos's outstretched hand. One afternoon, Carlos watched as Tiny, after much hesitation, climbed atop a fallen log, teetering precariously before jumping down with a triumphant yip. Carlos chuckled softly. "That's the spirit, kid," he murmured. The pups grew stronger by the day. Their legs, once wobbly and unsure, now carried them confidently across the clearing. They chased each other in endless circles, wrestling and pouncing with unbridled energy. Carlos often found himself laughing at their antics, the sound foreign to his ears, after so many years of silence. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Carlos would linger a little longer, reluctant to leave. Each day brought with it a deeper connection to this small family of wolves, and he found himself dreading the inevitable moment when they would no longer need him. For now, though, they did. And for Carlos, that was enough. Carlos trudged through the forest, his boots crunching softly against the frost-covered ground as the first rays of dawn filtered through the dense canopy. It was his usual route to visit Kira and her pups. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. As he neared the familiar clearing, something unusual caught his eye. He crouched down, inspecting the fresh tracks pressed into the soil. Human footprints, large and deliberate, leading directly toward the wolves' den. His heart quickened. Someone else was out here, and they were following Kira's trail. His mind raced as he silently moved from tree to tree, keeping to the shadows. It wasn't long before he spotted them, a group of 4 men, all carrying rifles slung over their shoulders and hunting knives strapped to their belts. They moved with purpose, their boots breaking branches and leaving a trail of disturbed snow. Carlos stayed hidden, watching from a safe distance as they paused to talk. "We've seen tracks near the ranch," one of them said, his voice gruff and impatient. "If we don't take care of these wolves now, they'll go after the livestock. It's only a matter of time." Another man, taller and wearing a battered hat, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, can't let it get out of hand. Wolves don't belong this close to people." He adjusted his rifle. "We end it today." Carlos clenched his fists, his breath caught in his chest. He knew these men weren't here to talk or scare the wolves off. They were here to kill. Kira and her family, who had done nothing wrong, were in grave danger. He had to act quickly. As the hunters continued toward the den, Carlos stepped out from behind a cluster of cedar trees. His boots crunched against the snow, drawing their attention. The men stopped, startled by his sudden appearance, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. "Hold it right there," Carlos said, his voice firm but steady. He raised his hands slightly, showing he was unarmed. "I know what you're here for, but I can't let you go any further." One of the hunters, the man with the battered hat, narrowed his eyes. "Who are you to stop us? You don't own these woods." "No, but I know the wolves you're after," Carlos replied, stepping closer. "That pack isn't a threat to anyone. They're just trying to survive, like the rest of us." The hunters exchanged skeptical glances. Another man, younger and leaner, scoffed. "You're defending wolves. They're dangerous predators. They'll tear through a herd of cattle without a second thought." Carlos took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I've been watching them for months. The female, Her name's Kira, was on the brink of death when I found her. I helped her through the winter, saw her give birth to her pups. They hunt small game in the forest. They've never come near your ranches or livestock." His words hung in the cold air, but the hunter's expressions remained unconvinced. Then a low growl broke the tense silence. From the edge of the clearing, the black wolf appeared, its yellow eyes locked onto the group. Its powerful frame bristled with tension, and in its mouth hung a freshly caught rabbit. It dropped the prey and let out another guttural growl, teeth bared. The hunters raised their rifles, startled. Carlos immediately stepped between them and the wolf, arms outstretched. "No! Lower your guns," he commanded. "This isn't what you think." The black wolf snarled again, but its eyes flickered toward Carlos as if waiting for his cue. Carlos turned back to the hunters, his voice firm yet calm. "That's their protector. He's doing what any of us would do, watching over his family. If you raise those guns, you'll make an enemy out of him and me." The men hesitated, their fingers hovering over their triggers. The black wolf took a cautious step forward, its growl deepening. Carlos held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "You want to protect your livestock. I get it. But killing this family won't solve your problems. These wolves are part of this forest. They don't want anything to do with you or your cattle." Minutes felt like hours as the two sides faced off. Finally, the man in the battered hat lowered his rifle, motioning for the others to do the same. "Fine," he said gruffly. "We'll leave them alone. But if we find tracks near the ranch again, it's on you to deal with it." Carlos nodded, relief washing over him. "I'll take responsibility. You have my word." The hunters exchanged a few more wary looks before turning back the way they came. Carlos watched as they disappeared into the trees, their voices fading into the distance. When he was sure they were gone, he let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Turning back toward the den, Carlos saw Kira peering out cautiously, her golden eyes meeting his. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she understood what had just transpired. Behind her, the pups huddled together, unaware of the danger that had just passed. The black wolf stood nearby, still on high alert, its sharp eyes scanning the woods for any remaining threats. Carlos approached the den, kneeling near its entrance. "It's okay," he murmured softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're gone now. You're safe." Kira tilted her head, her gaze steady and full of trust. The black wolf let out a low huff, as if in acknowledgement, before settling back into its vigilant stance outside the den. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Carlos sat beside the den, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He had protected Kira and her family today, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time danger would come their way. For now, though, the forest was quiet again, and that was enough. Spring had come to the forest. The snow, once heavy and unrelenting, had started to melt, revealing patches of green beneath. Birds sang in the early morning light, their melodies filling the air with life and hope. Carlos stood outside his cabin, watching the woods transform around him. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face, but couldn't shake the bittersweet feeling in his chest. Every day as he visited Kira and her family, it became clearer to him that their time together was coming to an end. The wolf pups, no longer fragile and dependent, had grown stronger and bolder. They chased each other through the softening snow, tumbling and barking in playful energy. Kira watched them with a calm and steady gaze, her posture proud and protective. The black wolf lingered nearby, always keeping a watchful eye. Carlos had spent months nurturing this little family through the harsh winter, but now, as the forest revived, he knew it was time for them to return to their true home. Carlos leaned against a tree, observing the pups as they explored. Tiny, the smallest of the litter, tried to pounce on his sibling, but missed and tumbled into the slushy snow. Carlos chuckled softly, the sound almost lost in the breeze. The scene warmed his heart, but the truth weighed heavy on his mind. He couldn't hold on to them forever. Wolves were meant to roam free, not live under the shadow of human care. He had done his part. Now it was their turn to face the wild. The decision, though right, wasn't easy. One morning, Carlos gathered his tools and walked to the shelter he had built for Kira. The structure, made of sturdy logs and lined with soft blankets, had been a sanctuary for the wolf and her pups. Carlos rested his hand on one of the wooden beams, his fingers lingering as if trying to imprint the memory of all it represented. With a deep breath, he began dismantling it piece by piece. As each log came down, Carlos spoke to Kira in a steady, low voice. "This was always meant to be temporary, girl," he said, pausing to look at her. She stood a few feet away, her amber eyes locked onto him. "You and your little ones, you're strong now. You can make it out there." He tried to keep his tone even, but the lump in his throat made his words falter. Kira didn't move closer, but she didn't back away either. She sat silently, her ears pricked forward, as if listening to every word. There was a wisdom in her gaze that Carlos couldn't quite explain. It was as if she understood his intentions, even though no words could truly bridge the gap between man and wolf. By midday, the shelter was gone, leaving only a bare patch of earth where it had stood. Carlos set his tools aside and knelt down near the pups. They crowded around him, their playful energy momentarily replaced by a quiet curiosity. One by one, he placed a hand on each of them, scratching behind their ears and murmuring softly. "You've all grown so much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tiny, you've got that spark in you. Don't ever lose it." The little pup nuzzled his hand, its small nose cold against his skin. Each pup seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their playful nature subdued. Kira approached him then, her movements deliberate and calm. She lowered her head, pressing it gently against his chest. Carlos wrapped his arms around her, his fingers brushing through her thick fur. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for trusting me, for letting me be a part of this." She pulled back slightly and licked his hand once, a brief but deliberate gesture. The black wolf stood a short distance away, his piercing gaze fixed on Carlos. He didn't move closer, but there was an unspoken understanding in the way he held his ground. Carlos nodded to him, as if acknowledging the silent pact between them. When the moment came for Kira to lead her family away, Carlos stood back, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The pups followed their mother, their small tails wagging as they trotted into the trees. The black wolf lingered for a moment longer, casting one last look at Carlos before disappearing into the underbrush. Carlos watched until the last flicker of movement vanished. The forest around him felt impossibly still. The warmth of the sun filtered through the branches, dappling the ground in golden light, but the emptiness in his chest was profound. He stayed there, unmoving, as the minutes stretched into hours. Finally, he turned and made his way back to the cabin. His steps were slow, his heart heavy, but there was also a quiet pride that carried him forward. He had done what was right, even if it hurt. Kira and her family belonged to the wild, and he had given them the chance to reclaim it. As he reached the cabin, Carlos glanced back toward the woods one last time. Somewhere out there, Kira and her pups were beginning their new chapter, and Carlos, though alone once more, felt a small measure of peace. Carlos returned to his wooden cabin, the only home he had known in the vast wilderness. The quietness of the forest, once a comfort, now felt strange and heavy. He would sit by the window, staring out at the thick woods, waiting for sounds that no longer came. The daily visits to Kira and her family, the soft howls that broke the stillness of the night, were gone. It was as though a piece of the forest had vanished, leaving an empty space in its place. The absence of Kira weighed on him, not just as a loss, but as a reminder of how deeply their lives had intertwined. In those early days, Carlos found himself walking aimlessly through the forest. He retraced old paths, stopping at the places where he had met Kira. Here was the snow-covered clearing where he had first seen her, weak and alone. There, beneath the old cedar, was where she had taken her first meal from his hand. He even visited the den where her pups were born, now a quiet hollow reclaimed by nature. At each stop, he stood in silence, as if expecting Kira to emerge from the shadows. But the forest offered only its stillness, a quiet reminder that time was moving forward, even if his heart still lingered in the past. To fill the emptiness, Carlos began writing. He pulled out an old notebook, the leather cover worn and cracked, and started to put his story into words. At first, the process felt strange. His hands, so used to chopping wood and holding a rifle, fumbled with the pen. But as the days passed, the words began to flow. He wrote about the moment he found Kira, her frailty, and the glint of defiance in her amber eyes. He described the shelter he had built for her, the warmth of her trust, slowly growing with each visit, and the bittersweet night of the storm when her pups came into the world. Every detail was etched into the pages, not just as memories, but as lessons he had learned from her. Writing became more than a distraction. It was a way for Carlos to understand how deeply he had changed. He had always seen the forest as a place of survival, a place where you either hunted or became the hunted. But Kira had shown him something else. Through her, he saw the balance of nature, the unspoken harmony in its cycles of life and death. He realized that every creature, no matter how small or fierce, had a role to play. He no longer felt like a conqueror of the wild, but a part of it, a witness to its quiet resilience. One evening, as Carlos finished writing another chapter, he paused and stared at the rifle hanging above the fireplace. It had been with him for years, a tool that had fed and protected him, but now it seemed out of place. Slowly, he stood up, took the rifle from its mount, and ran his fingers along its barrel. Memories of hunts came flooding back, some necessary, others regrettable. He took the rifle and carefully hung it on a different wall, high and out of reach, like a relic of another life. It was no longer a tool he would use, but a symbol of who he used to be. Carlos sat by the fire that night, feeling a quiet determination settle over him. He made a vow, not just to himself, but to the forest and its creatures. From now on, he would dedicate his life to protecting the wilderness he had once taken for granted. He would use his knowledge of the land not to hunt, but to safeguard, to ensure that other animals like Kira could thrive without fear. It wasn't just a decision, it was a promise. The next morning, Carlos stepped out of his cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. The forest greeted him with its familiar stillness, but now it felt different. He wasn't alone, even if Kira wasn't there. He knew her spirit, and the lessons she had taught him lived on in the rustle of the leaves and the whisper of the wind. As he walked toward the woods, he felt the weight of his old life lift, replaced by the quiet strength of someone who had finally found his true path. The forest was quiet that autumn afternoon, the kind of quiet that felt alive with hidden movements and whispers of the wild. Carlos walked slowly, his boots crunching against the golden leaves that blanketed the forest floor. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows that danced as the wind swayed the branches. He hadn't intended to venture far from his cabin today, just a peaceful stroll to enjoy the changing colors of the season. But then, it happened. A howl. Low, deep, and resonating. It echoed through the trees, weaving itself into the wind, tugging at a memory buried in his chest. Carlos froze mid-step. His heart quickened, a familiar ache of longing and recognition rising in him. That sound wasn't just any wolf's call. It was hers. It was Kira's. "Kira," he murmured aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, as though saying her name would summon her. The howl came again, closer this time, yet still hauntingly distant. Without hesitation, Carlos adjusted his worn hat and started moving, his pace brisk but deliberate. The path was familiar, so familiar that his feet found the way even when his mind was racing. He followed the sound, weaving through the trails he had walked so many times before. The forest had a way of shifting its moods, but today it seemed to lead him, its golden hues lighting the way forward. He passed the spot where he had first seen her lying in the snow all those months ago, and then the place where her pups had taken their first playful steps. Each step was a memory, each breath heavy with anticipation. Finally, he emerged into a small clearing, and there she was. Kira stood tall at the edge of the clearing, her silver coat gleaming in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. She was no longer the fragile, weary creature he had found in the depths of winter. She was majestic now, her body strong, her presence commanding. Standing by her side were 4 wolves, larger than he remembered, but still unmistakably her pups. They were lean and confident, each one bearing a trace of their mother's grace. And then there was the black wolf. Its piercing eyes met Carlos's for a brief moment, sharp but not threatening. It stood slightly behind Kira, its posture protective yet relaxed, as if acknowledging Carlos as an ally rather than a foe. Carlos felt a lump rise in his throat. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Kira. She watched him, her golden eyes calm, but brimming with something unspoken. And then, in a gesture that made Carlos's breath catch, she lowered her head slightly. It wasn't submission, it was acknowledgement, a silent thank you, spoken in the language of the wild. "Kira," he said again, this time louder, his voice filled with emotion he couldn't hold back. As if in response, Kira threw her head back and howled, a long, melodic cry that filled the clearing and stretched into the distance. One by one, her pups joined in, their voices weaving together in harmony. The black wolf added its voice, deep and resonant, anchoring the wild symphony. The sound was raw, powerful, and beautiful, a declaration of their presence and unity. Carlos stood rooted to the spot, tears streaming down his face as he listened. It wasn't sadness that overwhelmed him. It was something deeper, a profound joy mixed with the bittersweet knowledge of letting go. He laughed softly through the tears, shaking his head at the sheer magnificence of the moment. The howling subsided, and for a few moments, the clearing was filled with nothing but the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Kira took a step back, her gaze never leaving Carlos. She turned, her movements fluid and purposeful, and began leading her family back into the trees. Her pups followed closely, their tails swishing as they disappeared into the golden shadows. But, just before she vanished completely, Kira paused. She turned her head, looking back at Carlos one last time. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, Carlos felt the weight of all they had shared. He raised a hand, not to wave, but as a silent farewell. Kira's ears twitched, and then she was gone, her silver coat blending into the dappled light of the forest. Carlos remained standing in the clearing long after they had disappeared. The forest seemed quieter now, as though it too was absorbing the significance of what had just transpired. He took a deep breath, the cool autumn air filling his lungs, and smiled. It was a smile born not of loss, but of pride and gratitude. He had saved Kira once, but in many ways, she had saved him too. What had started as an act of kindness had grown into something far greater, a bond between man and nature, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things. Carlos turned and began walking back toward his cabin, the crunch of leaves underfoot a gentle soundtrack to his thoughts. The memory of Kira and her family would stay with him forever, etched into his heart like the paths he had walked in the forest. He didn't need to see them again to know they were thriving. They were out there, wild and free, exactly as they were meant to be. Carlos's bond with Kira reminds us of the incredible connections that can form when we choose kindness, even in the most unexpected situations. This wasn't just a story about a man and a wolf. It was a story about trust, resilience, and the beauty of letting go when the time is right. Have you ever had an experience with nature that stayed with you the way Kira stayed with Carlos? Let me know in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading your stories. And don't forget to like and share if this tale resonated with you. Thank you for watching.